Not yet.
Tell me when. Live?
Yes.
Good afternoon, dear audience. Good afternoon, students, researchers, professors. Good evening for those who are not in Brazil. Let me say to start with that it's a great honor and privilege to welcome you all here, particularly our dear teacher or lecturer, Professor Bruce Stewart. I'm very pleased to participate in this event as a chair for the opportunity to meet and hear Professor Bruce, even virtually. I met Bruce in Natal a long time ago when I went to the Irish Studies Conference organized by the University of Natal, of Rio Grande do Norte. I don't remember the year, but it seems it was a long, long time ago, more than 10 years. And I would like to stress the importance of events on Irish studies in Brazil, in Latin America, or any other country. They help us to improve the quality of learning in our universities, increase social inclusion, and construct an international knowledge network. Abe, the W.B. Yeats Chair of Irish Studies at the University of São Paulo, ARIS, ARIS at the Federal University of Bahia, and other groups have helped to consolidate Irish studies in Brazil and in its neighboring countries. The programs of our universities have continuously welcomed researchers who are interested in developing their dissertations and theses on Irish writers. National and international encounters are then opportunities many students have to access to relevant works developed by a great number of researchers. Today, we are very pleased and enthusiastic to welcome Professor Bruce take into account the proposal of his work he's going to discuss here. I believe Joyce's and Synge's researchers in the audience today are curious about the lecturer's talk. I am particularly interested in learning more about these two relevant figures of Irish literature in the light of the comparison Professor Bruce is going to draw here. I want to call the audience attention. We have here two different writers, as Professor Bruce says in the summary of his presentation. Joyce and Synge embody almost diametrically different versions of Irish literature during the literary revival. Moreover, they were also divided by class, religion, background, and attitudes to the ideals of the literary revival. One far away from Ireland, and the other one far away in Ireland. Okay? But before anything, let me introduce Professor Bruce and his experience in the area of Irish studies. Just a moment. Professor Bruce studied at Trinity College, Dublin, his PhD, and the University of California, MA, and taught at the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland for 25 years, and now he teaches at UFRN in Natal. He's assistant editor to the Oxford Companion to Irish Literature and has served as a secretary of the International Association for the Study of Irish Literature, IASIL, and the literary director of the Princess Grace Irish Library in Monaco. He has published widely on Irish literature and is the creator and editor of the Recurso website on Irish literature and its contexts. His book on James Joyce was published by Oxford University Press in 2004. So it's time to listen to hear Professor Bruce. Professor Bruce, welcome, because I believe we have many questions for you when you finish your talk. Welcome here, Professor.
Thank you, Noélia. Thank you very much. It's nice to see you again, and it's very nice to be at AB EI, Stewart Irlandaise. And, you know, please take for granted my warm greetings to Munira, Izara, and all the other members of this fantastic organization. An amazing publication record, by the way, over the years. You really are a big publisher in the field. John Vanville and so many others, McGahern. So I'm going to launch in because I was invited to give a keynote, and I wrote a lecture which is a little bit longer. And, you know, I hope that the association will publish it at some stage. So it exists. And in fact, I'm going to start with the first page of it, but I've decided to go to PowerPoint, which everyone does these days. And I hope to come in 35 minutes or maybe a tiny bit longer so that we can have questions if the format allows. I'm going to introduce my PowerPoint straight away to cut business short. And I have no idea whether we can see each other. Oh yes, we seem to see each other at the same time. I hope it's not obscured. Joyce and Synge, The Exile and the Tramp. Now there are two epigraphs which I hope you care to scan. The first is, Synge is a storm center, according to Joyce, I have done nothing. And the second is rather famous. You have Buck Mulligan castigating Stephen in Ulysses for his behavior towards Synge, and indeed his behavior towards Lady Gregory, both of whom he has insulted in various ways. The tramper Synge is looking for you, he says, to murder you. He heard you pissed on his hall door in Gashtu. There's no evidence for that, but in fact, Synge was living in Gashtu at the time. And need a clicky operation here to get. I begin with some of my own text, and I'll simply scan it very briefly so that you know and I know what I'm talking about today. Most studies of Synge and Joyce begin with their first meeting in Paris, which occurred in 1903, when Joyce went on his first international outing, his Exile and Experiment in Life. The second, on that occasion, Joyce sternly criticized Synge's Riders to the Sea and accused it of lacking the Aristotelian unities required for tragedy by Greek law, aesthetic rule, I should say. Joyce at that time was reading in the St. Genevieve Library, and aesthetics was his interest. Chiefly he was reading Aristotle. He didn't tell anyone, but he was reading Musenke's Hegelianism as well. The second occasion of their meeting was a drunken episode when Joyce fell down in the corridor of a rehearsal of the Well of the Saints in June 1904. And the third occasion was almost inadvertent when when Synge's Playboy of the Western World encountered riots in Dublin in 1907. Joyce, then in Trieste, pricked up his ears in enormous interest and with enormous frustration because he couldn't clearly see or hear what was going on. But he evidently underwent something of a change of mind about Synge, whom he had previously regarded as a peasant dramatist, or I should say an Anglo-Irish dramatist who took peasants as his material. And this is something that Joyce didn't particularly approve because he was international by temper and outward bound. In fact, his purpose in Paris was to be international, so to be dragged back to Irish material, and particularly Irish provincial material, didn't suit him at all well. He didn't, of course, know anything about Synge beyond what he'd read in Riders to the Sea when Synge pressed the manuscript or typescript, properly speaking, into his hands. Later again, he produced a play of Synge's in Zurich with Nora Barnacle in the role of Kathleen, one of the girls, the daughters of Moira, the suffering tragic heroine who loses her two children to the sea. It shows not only an interest in, a growing interest in Synge, but a growing interest in the identity between Nora as a West of Ireland person, she came from Galway, and the literature which Synge was effectively sponsoring, or one might say, figureheading. He could have played other plays, for example, In the Shadow of the Glen was available to him, The Shadow of the Glen, which might have suited much better because the theme was much more Joycean, but he chose the one act, he called it a dwarf tragedy, and he described Synge as a tragic poet, a rather archaic description, which somehow happily describes the quality of the verse in it. As to criticism, Anne Fogarty has recently suggested that an examination of the substance of the meeting would reveal that the hostility between the two men involves convergences between their aesthetic as well. And she further adds that Joyce was haunted by the influence of Synge down the years, and that he came to admire his capacity to deliver insights into the primitivist truth of Irish society and to invent texts that are defiantly different and modern. Now, that all may be true, but my job this afternoon is to deepen some of those insights by drawing out the narrative of Joyce's early years, 1903 to 1907, and trying to measure exactly the respects in which he was influenced by Synge. And I'll begin by introducing Synge, or rather, I'll let W.B. Yeats do so, because I think many of you will know Yeats's famous paragraph in which he claims that he sent Synge to the west of Ireland to write about a people who had never been written about and to produce plays of the literary revival. Now, in fact, Synge was already a great traveller and had been to the west of Ireland, or had been to West Kerry, and had been to Connemara, and had been to Wicklow. So he didn't need that kind of encouragement. But Yeats was determined to cast him in the role of, as he calls it in the Municipal Gallery Revisited, that solitary man, Johnsingh, who was independent of all the shibboleths and conventions of society, both the bourgeois shibboleths and the nationalist shibboleths as well. And he regarded him as a man who was the only man he'd ever known incapable of political thought or humanitarian purpose. Now, very few of us today would admire that because we're a very humanitarian generation, of course. But for Yeats, it meant that he was approximating to the condition of a tragic hero. Tragic joy might be the apposite phrase in this case. And he was independent of any concept of gain or power or whatever else it may be. He didn't, in fact, send him to the Aran Islands, but we'll allow ourselves to believe he did. He began to write a kind of drama, which we see here in Riders to the Sea, includes very famously the lines, Michael has a clean burial in the far north, by the grace of God Almighty. Berkeley will have a fine coffin out of the white boards and a deep grave surely. What more can we want than that? No man at all can be living forever, and we must be satisfied. We know now, incidentally, that the last sentence is a more or less direct quotation from a letter which was written to Synge, which means Synge was actually, in some sense, reporting what he was hearing from people, although at the same time he was obviously inventing strenuously a new kind of stage idiom. For example, in the Playboy, Christy Mann says with rapture, if the mitred bishops seen you that time, they'd be like of the holy prophets, I'm thinking, to be straining the bars of paradise to lay eyes on the Lady Helen of Troy, and she abroad, pacing back and forth with a nosegay in her golden shawl. Now, it didn't take people long to point out that this wasn't actually the way Irish peasants spoke at all, and that it was something of an invented language. And some regarded it as a travesty, and some regarded it as an independent literary achievement. And indeed, that battle continued a long time. But it's worth pointing out that it has a pedigree. I'll do this rather quickly. Douglas Hyde had issued his Auron Gra, Puig Connacht, which is the love songs of Comet, in 1993, a very early date in revival terms, and he pulled off an extraordinary feat. Declan Kybert elucidated this in 1979 in his Sing in the Irish Language. He produced English translations, as you can see at the bottom of the left-hand page, but in the footnotes, he also produced an inter-translation, which he calls a literal translation. We'll look at it just in a moment. And there's another example we looked at, which is Lady Gregory's translation of the play, The Twisting of the Rope, also by Douglas Hyde, who ultimately became a president of Ireland, the New Ireland. And we might see on the next screen what these look like in a slightly more detailed way. Hyde translates, "My grief is on the sea, it is that big. Is it that it is going between me and my 1,000 treasures? I was left at home making grief without any hope. A bed of rushes was under me last night. I threw it out in the heat of the day. My love came to my side, shoulder to shoulder and mouth to mouth." Now, Stephen Dedalus writes a poem based on the last line in Ulysses. It is, of course, a famous example of Joycean plagiarism because it didn't belong to him at all. But at a certain level, he surely regarded it as a reference to Douglas Hyde and the revival. The kind of language you get in the Comet play is rather different. "I am, and 3/4 of my heart is burned and scorched and consumed, struggling with the world and the world struggling with me." Now, this is Hiberno English, of course. It's a curious language which is more sensitive in some sense, but much blunter, and the accusation that it's Iron Age, barbaric in another. It is, of course, the result of the great language shift, which forced Irish people to learn the English language well or poorly as their circumstances allowed. When Joyce reached Paris, he lodged at the Grand Hotel Corneille, which had been recommended to him by John Millet and Synge as a result of Lady Gregory's asking him to do so. When Joyce first arrived, he was on a mission which is commemorated at the end of A Portrait of the Artist, in which he speaks the famous sentence or writes in his diary, "Welcome, O life, I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience and forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." The reality was much harsher. He was living impecuniously in Paris. He couldn't enter the medical college he intended to attend, and he was felt himself to be observed by members of the Irish literary revival, who were all a lot better off than he was. You have George Russell, Synge himself, you have Lady Gregory and W.B. Yeats. I won't recount the famous meeting with W.B. Yeats where he said, "You are too old for me to teach you anything." A piece of high impertinence, as Yeats called it, insuperable conceit. But Joyce was like that, and I'm interested in figuring out why he was like that at that age. Well, there's young Joyce, and obviously he is a fairly conceited young man. Looks rather well, I think, in his yachting shoes and his West of Ireland cap. Lady Gregory responded, he wrote to Lady Gregory announcing his intention to travel with some extraordinary sentences. First of all, he played the anti-Catholic card, I'm sorry to say. He knew very well that they liked their own religion better than his. But he himself virulently hated Catholicism at this stage, as we will see. "There is no heresy or philosophy which is so abhorrent to my church as a human being," he told her. And he told her, "Though I seem to have been driven out of my country here as a misbeliever, apostate, I have found no man yet with a faith like mine." Lady Gregory was distinctly interested in this young man, and she wrote to Yeats, encouraging Yeats to give him breakfast in London. And she wrote to Synge for advice on cheap lodgings in Paris. And she also got him a job reviewing. And indeed, she got a reviewer of Longworth at the Daily Express to give him a copy of Poets and Dreamers, her own book, which had been produced in 1902. He volunteered it, I should say. That's mistaken information. "I wonder what the review will be like." Well, she's shortly to find out what Joyce's true mettle is. When Synge saw him, he made some general comments about his state of affairs, he seemed very badly off. Indeed, he was rather indolent, spending his studious hours in the National Library. It was actually Saint Genevieve reading Ben Jonson. It was actually Ben Jonson and Boussonquet and Aristotle. French life is, French literature apparently is beneath him. He's not interested in studying French literature, although we know that at some stage he was very well versed in Flaubert and other writers of that ilk, particularly Flaubert, from whom he borrowed the theory of personality. Synge thought, I cannot think he will ever be a poet of importance, but his intellect is extraordinarily keen. And if he keeps fairly sane, he ought to do excellent essay writing. We'll see why his intellect was keen in a moment in relation to Synge and the nature of their colloquy, their exchange. But first of all, I want to explain something about the shape of Irish culture. Nothing new, in fact. I've heard it mentioned already in this conference. It was divided, obviously, between the Anglo-Irish and the Irish. But the peculiar features is some Anglo-Irish, such as Yeats himself, had crossed over and had attempted to use material which was understood generally to be the material of native Ireland and the native Irish language to launch a new literature. Whether it was going to be an antiquarian romantic literature or a modernist literature wasn't perfectly clear. But Joyce had a reaction. In Portrait of the Artist, we see those wonderful sentences where he walks towards his university being University College, very fine building, Cardinal Newman's college in Buck Whaley's house, and passes Trinity College, which he describes as the grey block of Trinity on his left, set heavily in the city's ignorance, like a dull stone in a cumbrous ring. I think we should take that word ignorance quite seriously. He does feel the city is extraordinarily ignorant. And the Dubliner stories have got that sense, if nothing else. The people just aren't self-aware and they're not educated. Indeed, they can be chronically educated in things they should be educated about, such as the mottos of the Pope, as we see in Grace. But at the same time, he thinks himself, it wounded him to think he would never be but a shy guest at the feast of the world's culture. And that the monkish learning, in terms of which he was trying to forge out a philosophy, was held no higher by the age he lived in than the subtle and curious jargons of heraldry and falconry. Now, he means that he's exploring Thomas Aquinas, which is learned from the Jesuits, and Aristotle, and he's not going to explore the pragmatists and empiricists of the Anglo-American tradition. He's not interested in humane philosophy and so forth. I should choose my examples better if I deliver this again. But distinctly, he's involved in a defense, a kind of anti-Reformation recusancy, defending Catholic culture against Protestant culture. And Protestant culture wasn't too fond of him either. In fact, Lily Yates, who was a very nice lady, said when she read Dubliners, since I read Dubliners, I feel I know something of their lives. Who are they? Of their lives, I knew nothing when I went, what went on behind the dirty windows like those behind which James Stephen's charwoman lived, which were so dirty, anyone wishing to look in had to open them. In other words, she regarded the Catholic population of Dublin as a kind of underclass whose lives couldn't be attractive or interesting anyway at all. And J.M. Hone had rather the same view, except this, by the way, is a man who managed, or owned, I should say, the proprietor of Monsell, the company which refused Joyce's Dubliners, so he can hardly be considered an impartial writer. He said, Mr. Joyce's books exhibit the character of the semi-anglicized farming or shopkeeper class, a Catholic democracy in Ireland with opportunities for an inexpensive university education. And then towards the end, I'll move on rather quickly, he says, when I first read The Portrait of the Artist, it seemed to me the book announced the passing of that literary Ireland in which everyone was well bred. Now, that's a famous accusation slung against Joyce by Virginia Woolf. And it was true that the dominant culture was concerned with what they call breeding, whatever that is. I think we've exploded that one since then. And Joyce's retaliation was to write, first of all, in 1904, an essay called The Portrait, in which he tried, as it were, to invent a personality which would leap over this particular form of social derogation. And in so doing, he adopted, in my view, Thomas Carlyle's theory of egoism in The Hero of Man's Letters, and he wrote some remarkable sentences. He said, "It is part of the ineradicable egoism that he was afterwards to call his Redeemer, that he conceived converging on him the thoughts and deeds and thoughts of the universe." Or he said his family expected him to follow the path of remunerative respectability and save the situation. He thanked their intention. It had first fulfilled him with egoism, and he rejoiced that his life had been so self-centered. He's not going to help at all. He quotes directly from Carlyle when he says, "The poet is the intense center of the life of his age, absorbing in himself the life that surrounds him and flinging it abroad amongst planetary music." And this idea is the idea behind the primitive epiphany, by the way. The artist is the sensitive who picks up things around him and recirculates them. And yet the idea of paralysis, according to which the country was, he used to say, of course, to the Roman, not the assassin, was the tyrant of the country. The country was dominated by the farce of Irish Catholicism. He specifies Irish Catholicism, and he talks of a country where Caesar confesses Christ and Christ confesses Caesar, hand in glove. And he also talks about spiritual paralysis, which is a famous term in Joycean criticism, developed at that early stage. When Joyce did write a review of Lady Gregory, he wrote what we would call a slagging review. He said, "The new work is set in a land almost fabulous in its sorrow and senility," which is the same insult that he cast at James Joyce. "The storytellers are old, and their imagination is not the imagination of childhood." Very tough criticism, and she was duly shocked, and so was Buck Mulligan, who said, "Longworth is awfully sick," he said, after what you wrote about that old hake Gregory, "you inquisitional drunken Jew Jesuit. She gets you a job on the paper, and then you slate her drivel to Jesus. Couldn't you do the Yeats touch?" Yeats had said, "The finest book to come out of Ireland in our time," when he reviewed Cuchulainn in 1902. Reporting on Synge, Joyce says, "Synge is here to sell out. He can't get on either." That's rather nice. It implies that Joyce has failed to make a living in Paris, but so has Synge. And it was 2 years going back to Dublin to engage in the Irish Literary Theatre. Synge gave me his Riders to the Sea. I read it. It's a play in the Aran dialect, peasant dialect. I'm glad to say that ever since I read it, I've been riddling it mentally till it has not a sound spot in it. He wrote there. In other words, he maliciously destroyed the play. And to destroy it, he employed Aristotle. Now, there's a long history here, but there's nothing less appropriate than using the rules of Aristotle's poetics to destroy a play of Synge. And it's quite contrary to Joyce's own theory of criticism, as I hope to show you in a moment. But he was informed by his animosity against literary theatre. In fact, he had translated plays already. He'd written A Brilliant Career, which he dedicated to my own soul. And he translated Hauptmann in 2 plays, including Vorsprung Sonnen and Michael Kramer. And he hadn't submitted them yet because he knew that the theatre already turned to peasant drama. But in 1904, he did submit those plays. And Yeats said, first of all, that the German was terrible. He'd given it to somebody, to a lady, in fact, who knew German, and she said it was a very poor translation. And secondly, that he didn't see his way to putting German plays on the stage at the moment. I'm sorry, I seem to have gone back instead of forward. He was still talking about it in 1916 when he explained to Harriet Shaw Weaver that he had ripped the lights out of Synge's play when he saw it. The Playboy Riot is probably the next temporal event in Joyce's connection with Synge. And it occurred, of course, when Synge's rambunctious play appeared on stage in 1907 and deeply upset the nationalist sensibilities of the period. Douglas Hyde had earlier said that he's no hesitation in saying that every Irishman who hates the name of West Britain, you remember that Gabriel Conroy in The Dead is called West Britain, should set his efforts to encourage the Irish tongue. We must strive to cultivate everything that is most racial, most smacking of the soil, most Gaelic, most Irish, because this island is and ever will remain Gaelic to the core. He spoke of Arthur Griffith, described it as a foul play. Time is going extremely fast, and this is not going to work for me. Foul Play, he said, it was a vile and inhuman story written by a moral degenerate who has dishonored Irish women in the main. And Joyce noted, reading about it in English papers in Rome, by the way, that Synge had offended with the phrase in their shifts alone, and tells his brother again the story of Synge asking him to read the play and how he expounded a long attack on the catastrophe. That would be the peripety in catastrophe and catharsis in the Aristotelian sense. But he did say, Synge is a storm sent and I have nothing, which strikes a profound note of jealousy. He didn't quite have nothing because at this stage he had planned a short story called Ulysses, but he hadn't started it. And it's a matter of conjecture why he didn't. I believe he didn't start because he had suffered a great number of setbacks in Rome and Trieste, and he was no longer the egoist that he had previously been. And he was going to write the egoist out of his life in the Ulysses story, as he eventually did in the Ulysses novel. But he wasn't quite able to manage it at that stage. So instead he wrote The Dead, which is something of a midway house where Gabriel Conroy, who is a bit like James Joyce, especially if James Joyce had stayed in Dublin and become an intellectual, accedes to the wishes of his wife to visit the west of Ireland where she was born. And in it, the most important sentence unquestionably is the time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Now, this is a litmus test of your reading of Joyce. If you consider that means that Joyce is, in some sense, relenting and giving in to the westward indigenous impulse of the Irish later revival, you will tend to see the story as a nationalist revolutionary script. And that's how it's rather seen today. I won't belabor this, but in fact, Kevin Whelan, in a brilliant essay in the Harvard Review, has suggested that it's actually a commemoration of the famine dead. Who are the dead in the famine? Who are the dead in the dead? The answer is the famine dead. There are other dead, of course, there's Michael Fury, but there's also Joyce's mother, who's buried in the dead. I'm going to leave my analysis of it alone. There's another play by Synge, of great pertinence to his development. That is The Shadow of the Glen, the story in which a tramp comes to the door. The farmer is pretending to be dead to catch his wife in adultery. He seduces the wife with his golden eloquence. And when the man jumps up again, she agrees to go out on the cold roads with the tramp rather than stay in the comfort of the farm with her husband. Joyce had no direct use for this, but just as Synge had actually reversed a narrative of this kind, or rather, just as Synge had reversed the narrative of the sugong, that's to say the twisting of the rope in this story, instead of saving the young maiden from the tramp, in this case, the tramp manages to win the young maiden and take her with her on her, she's not so young, on his traveling ways. So there's a process of reversal going on in which both Joyce and Synge are participating. Now, you may not entirely agree with me, but I see a direct echo of this play and a clear knowledge of this play in a certain scene in Joyce's The Portrait of the Artist. When he was writing Dubliners, he told his brother that he was going to completely reform Stephen Dedalus and turn it into 5 chapters. But he did rather more than that, in fact, because he completely reformed Stephen Hero. He didn't change the character, he changed our attitude towards the character, and he put him in brackets. When he started writing Ulysses, he told Frank Budgeon that Stephen has a shape which cannot change. He's no longer interested in him. He's interested in Bloom.
Professor, 5 minutes to finish it.
5 minutes. This is a very statistical.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
And so it was. He staged the play with Nora because she had an Aaron accent, and there is a picture of her. But speaking to Power and Conversation, he insisted once again that he thought that Synge spoke a fabricated language. I must show you this Bad Like Soul because, crucially, it's a story in which a young man experiences something very like the Shadow of the Glen. He's invited into the house of a country woman, and of course he goes away because he's a nice young man. But in fact, Joyce decides to view her as a type of her race and his own, a bat-like soul, waking to the consciousness of itself in darkness and secrecy and loneliness. This is an important text for the history of modern Irish sexuality. There can be no doubt at all. But it would also be seen as a reversal of Castle on Chugong and as following in the wake of the shadow of the Glen. Rather to end up, he didn't resign his critical view of Synge's first plays, but he did stage him, and showed appreciation in that form. He had a strong antipathy to the idea of the peasant in culture. He had the old man whom Mulrennan meets in A Portrait of the Artist. I fear him, I fear his red-rimmed, horny eyes. It is with him I must struggle all this day. And then finally, till what? He yield to me, I mean him no harm. It's not aggressive, he let him live, but he doesn't see him as a centre of Irish writing. At the end, of course, we find him going abroad and adopting cosmopolitanism instead of national literature. Noélia, I'm going to finish with this slide. In it, you see Joyce's epiphany in Ulysses, in which he celebrates his meeting with Synge. I should say commemorate, because not celebration. It's a very beautiful piece of epiphanic writing. The references are all around you. Harsh gargoyle face that warred against me over the mess of our hash of lights in the Rue Saint-André des Arts. Now, Synge had this extraordinary face, very harsh, and the description is quite, there are lots of gargoyles in the Ile de France where Notre Dame is, and there's the Rue Saint-André in front of us. He went on picnics in Clamart Wood, Fawn Man, a good Spencerian reference, brandishing a wine bottle. C'est vendredi saint, he says, murdering Irish. That's the language, of course, which Spencer uses to describe the nature of the country, but it also means murdering the Irish language. His image wandering, he met, I mine. And that suggests a mirror image of some kind, unless he means they met their own image. I met a fool in the forest. I'm going to end on that note, but I just wanted in one word summary to say that Joyce didn't follow Synge. He once worried that they would call Synge his master. But he recognized the magnitude of Synge's achievement, and the magnitude essentially is in subversion, or a quality which Joyce himself attributed to Heinrich Ibsen in a letter that he wrote to him in 1901 when he spoke about his inward heroism. Both Joyce and John Millington Synge possess, in a significant idea, that quality of inward heroism, which is so important for great literature. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Professor Bruce, for this lovely talk, very rich talk. And I also wanted to thank every one of you present here in this conference. It is you in this virtual room and many others who are not present who have helped us to continue developing our research and organize events on Irish studies in Brazil and abroad. But before the audience ask their questions, I wanted to ask Professor Bruce a few ones. My first question is, was Joyce envious of the enormous impact Synge had on the Irish audience?
On the Irish people, on the Irish impact on, once again?
My question is,
I got the first part. Was he aware of the enormous impact?
Was Joyce envious of the enormous impact Synge had on the Irish audience?
I think initially he was. I don't think it was a question of personal jealousy. He thought that he was a token of Yeats and Lady Gregory's very purposeful decision to promote peasant drama. And he was interested in Ibsen, and he was interested in modern drama. He translated, and later, of course, he wrote Exiles, about which we heard during this week. So one might say, but in fact, it was more frustration and indeed resentment, but not personal, as it were, envy. You remember the Nora once said, Jim says he's beaten everyone except that man Shakespeare. And he didn't tend to sense any inferiority in his own attainments and achievements. He was well praised by Yeats as well. Yeats said he achieved more than any man of his age who had lived far from the centres of civilization, which is rather good. But he said centres of culture, which is what Dublin was in that period. And Joyce was very well aware of his provincial status, but he was also aware of the fact that he'd broken all the bounds by becoming a European leader. So I say in summary, no, he didn't experience any envy, but he was aware of the fact that Synge was getting the accolades that he wasn't. That's why he said, Synge is the center of the storm, and I have done nothing. He couldn't get published. He was blocked by people who thought his writing repulsive.
Thank you. Thank you. The other question is, was Joyce influenced by the creative writing of Synge with regard to the concepts of confession, vacillation, and transformation? And on the other way round, how did Joyce exert influence on Synge's works?
Joyce had no influence on Synge. Absolutely not. And as to Synge's influence on him, I've identified the episodes in which I think there's some sense of it's following the cultural narrative in Synge. You may use the word vacillation and confession, and I've forgotten the third one, and you're obviously pointing at something, but I don't know what it is. There's no particular element of confession in Synge, and Joyce dispenses with confession in the 4th chapter of A Portrait of the Artist, and it never comes back.
Thank you. Let's see the other questions. I believe the audience have questions for you.
Would that be nice? Do you see anything? I can't see anything. Should I look somewhere?
Yes, I cannot see you anymore. I think something happened here.
You can't see me. You can't see me.
No, I cannot see you anymore. Oh my God, what happened? Anyway, doesn't matter. Questions, Gisele, I think Gisele has a question to make. Okay, thank you. Nice. Gisele? Okay, I think Gisele has sent me the question. Just a moment, Professor. I think, okay, let me see here no chat. Onde está esse chat? Não estou conseguindo. Ela disse que mandou para o seu chat, professor. She has sent the question to you. Can you read it?
I'm sorry, participants chat. I'm sorry, I'll look at chat and see that. Okay, everyone is just praising. That's very nice. On YouTube, everything is okay. Hey, everybody, please, let's bear in mind we have to finish on the 16th. Okay. Well, let's just stop now, shall we? The conference in the town, 12, very good. I don't see any questions. I just see some nice remarks. Questions. Professor Stewart has so much to teach us. They're gorgeous.
Oh, yes.
That's what I get.
Has so much to teach us. We have so much to learn here that we are all sure that if the next symposium is held in Natal again, we all largely benefit from it. Yes.
Very much.
Okay.
Okay, Noélia, is that it?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for coming, for accepting our invitation and join us this afternoon. We hope to meet you sometime. Doesn't matter where, in Natal or São Paulo, anywhere. Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.